Philip was here and he was like this.
Feel free to stand out to the side.
How was everyone this morning? Have a good time last night?
Yes.
I went to bed early compared to you, but late for me. So I'm tired this morning. Okay, so last night the trainers were talking, and kind of based on some of the rounds that we saw, there was a discussion that we should have a talk about language use in rounds, right? And so yesterday, I know that for Philip's lecture, he talked a little bit about how his experience was that, particularly for ESL and EFL teams, he would see that teams would complain after a round that the bottom half had made the same arguments that they made and then taken a ranking above them. They said, but they just said the same thing, but just prettier or fancier, right? And that he made the point yesterday to all of you that if you're using different words, it cannot be the same argument, right? And I have also witnessed this with native speakers, right? A lot of times they didn't say anything different from what we said, but they got the ranking, right? So why would it be that you would feel like the other team made the same arguments, but the judges thought it was different? And what made it different? Right? What are some ways that it was different? Why didn't the judges recognize it as being the same? What do you think? I mean, do you think that we just have this kind of very short memory and didn't realize, or maybe we're just kind of so ignorant that we didn't realize that's the same argument? What makes it different?
Maybe it was more persuasive the way they said it.
Okay, why would it be more persuasive?
Wording, framing.
Okay, good. So this is honestly a really broad topic and not something that I think that we can necessarily accomplish in 50 minutes, but I'm going to attempt to introduce some of the things that I want you to at least be thinking more about, right? And another discussion that came up among the trainers is kind of the range that we have in here. So for some of you, this might seem very basic. For others, it might seem like brand new concepts. So please, please, please ask questions so that we can kind of address all the different levels that we have in here. So when you're talking about using different words, that also happens within a team, right? And often I give, and sometimes this is at the lower levels, but I give feedback in my adjudication to use the same taglines or use the same words for your overview, right? Because just like a judge or other teams might not recognize that it's the same argument from top to bottom, even within a partnership, you think you're saying the same thing, and maybe the judge does not recognize that as the same argument between the two speakers, or maybe, and this happens quite a bit too, two speakers don't completely understand the argument in the same way when they're using different words. So the words matter, right? And using very specific words matters, right? So both within your team and then also if you're trying to differentiate, this is something that you want to be thinking about. So we're going to talk today about why it's important to think about how language is used, and I'm going to talk about this in 3 ways. Why it's important from a theoretical perspective, kind of a grossly simplified theoretical perspective. Why it's important in the debate round, and I'm going to talk about specific word choice and then contextual language use. And then we're going to hopefully get a little bit to why things go wrong and try to brainstorm some strategies when we don't have the right words or when we could do better, right? So theoretically, kind of oversimplified. Speech act theory is a view of language that it's a form of action, right? So you perform an action simply by uttering words. So what does that mean, right? So this has kind of evolved to say that all language is performative, not just a command. Open the door, right? And you really can. But also things like to promise, right? To lie, to demand, right? These are all things that actually perform an action. So this is something to kind of take into consideration because we're doing an activity where that's what we're using, words, right? Sapir-Whorf, linguistic relativism. How many of you are familiar with the concept, Sapir-Whorf theory? No? Okay, good. So this is kind of meaning our perceptions, right? How we see the world is closely tied to the language we have. And so there's a continuum between linguistic determinism, meaning we can only perceive what we have words for, to linguistic relativism, meaning the language that we have definitely influences the way we perceive the world. And although very, very few people would still say determinism is it, meaning I know that you're all highly intelligent people, and if we talk long enough, even if your language doesn't have a word for a concept, we can communicate that concept, right? You're not completely blocked out of understanding that concept. But still, there is this like relative way of seeing things, and some of the very like common and once again oversimplified examples that they use is like native peoples in Alaska have many, many words for snow, right? In American English, we have one word, snow, right? We have some variations that are like snow, maybe sleet, but we're talking like maybe 4 at the most, right? Versus 50 to 70 words in some Alaskan languages, right? Because their livelihood, their existence depends on those different states of snow. So they're much more in tune. And many would argue they actually perceive the differences in snow much more quickly because they have words to differentiate it. Does that make sense? Okay. Another example that's used quite a bit is color, right? A lot of people think of color as being absolute, right? But what color is the sun? Yellow, white, red. Okay, so the sun isn't the same color for everyone. It depends on how you've kind of understood through language that object to be, right? So it definitely influences our perception. Now, if I stop and tell you, it's not that we are seeing the color differently, right? If I stop and we really have a discussion, what's probably the most accurate answer of those 3? White, right? But I know that in my culture, yellow is kind of the first thing you think of, right? No, but it's not yellow at all, right? And I would probably argue that it's also not red. But kind of a white or a non-color is what it is. But we are conditioned to perceive things in a certain way. And when you think of the sun, a lot of times your immediate image is that color that you've associated it with, even though you've never actually seen it to be that color. So we're tracking so far, right? So definitely the language we use influences. And when we think of things like identity, culture, gender, language comes into play in how we perceive all of these things. So we go back to this performative aspect of language and we start to see how this ties together and definitely how it ties in debate. So Judith Butler, she saw gender as being produced and created through sustained social performances, including language. And so One kind of very, very simple example is yesterday we did a motion on, in my practice, on LGBTQI groups, right? And people would comment how the letters have expanded over the years, right, for that group. Why would that be? Anyone? Why would that have changed over time?
Increased awareness and acceptance of the range of human sexuality.
Okay, and to better describe, right, that group?
A lot of the names within like transgender, transsexual community continue to change. So like now we've added the I because it's intersexual, and we've also accepted queer identity as like a new form because we say that queer is a different like thing from LGBT. It's like more of a pansexual view. So some of those terms are like just the same terms in different ways because it's kind of hard to say what people want to be called and like which is the like norm of what we should actually call these people because it's literally argued every year and it changes like every year basically.
Right. So it's constantly being socially constructed, right? We're trying to reflect the perceptions that people have and the understandings people have of their own and other identities, and it's always changing, right? But language is intimately tied with those perceptions, right? So society and language are so closely intertwined that we can't really say that they're independent because language is both reflecting it and at the same time it's influencing and creating these social concepts. So how does this relate to power and power relationships? So in society, power is often secured not so much by the threat of punishment, but by internalization of norms, right? And we talk a lot about norms and values in debate, and the prevailing discourse within the social order, which we're also perpetuating and hopefully changing and influencing through this activity, right? And so I think it's important to look at language critically, both at a macro and a micro level. And we're going to focus on micro today in the time that we have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the macro issues in another lecture. But ideas, when I say macro, are like branches of society that use language to wield power, like the media, like government, right? How social order is controlled by language status. And a lot of you have different experiences with the status of your language, both where you live or maybe your English language status. Right, definitely plays into how you fit in a specific group, how you fit into a certain society, right? And then how also individuals are subjugated by language or by the choices they use in language. And so language policies can be used to control societies, and once again, I'll talk about that in a different lecture. But the ways that we convey a message from a specific perspective influences beliefs. And that's kind of what we want to at least have more awareness of when we're debating. So kind of once again looking at that Worfian perspective, some would say that language use will necessarily influence the world, their worldview and perceived reality. So even though we might not say that's the only way you can perceive, it's generally accepted that language influences how we perceive. So in-round micro level influence of language, so word choice. Euphemism, right? So kind of softening or sometimes downplaying one's own aggression. So what are some examples of euphemism? Involvement. The military has tons of them, right? So involvement, excuse me?
Collateral damage.
Collateral damage, okay? And that can be both euphemism and mysticism because it's so somewhat removed. What is collateral damage?
Could be a bridge blowing up, or it could be people dying.
Yeah. So it's a nice way to say, kind of we killed something, right? Involvement often means invasion. We use terms like targets often when, it's not what you would think of as like a shooting target, but maybe a person or a building, right? Correctional facility, right? Because it sounds almost educational. Adult entertainment, right? Friendly fire is one. Once again, I said that the military has a lot of them. Enhanced interrogation techniques. And then even just in our everyday life, now it's been for at least a few decades, when you buy a used car, what is it called?
Pre-owned.
Pre-owned, right? Not not used, or So can you think of any other examples of ways that we kind of soften the language?
Intervention,
Okay, good.
early intervention, could mean invasion as well, or some other times.
Right, and in some ways we're creating more vague language because we kind of don't want to say specifically what it is, right? We don't want that emotional perception to kind of come up. And then there's dysphomism, so exaggerating the bad qualities of one's opponent, right? And once again, we do this. Can you think of any examples of that? What do we sometimes call enemy combatants? Yeah. But what might they call themselves? Right. So we're seeing both ends of this, right? And then the mystification, so things like defoliate, bombing countryside, or collateral damage. So things that kind of sometimes are so removed, using jargon, right, to kind of take away from what it is. So I'm going to look at some terms and do a little bit of deconstruction, talking about what the implications of using certain words in rounds are, even words that we use all of the time and that on face might seem somewhat harmless. So underclass, or there's some equivalents, but underclass, what does that mean? Okay. Why is it problematic to use this term? What are some of the reasons? There's lots. What?
Because the prefix under makes them seem as if they're kind of subpar, beneath our usual expectations for what a class should be.
Okay. So this carries a lot of judgmental baggage, right? This word, and the way that it's used, in some ways, can be considered a euphemism for certain groups, right? But it can also be seen as a more negative, right? So it's also problematic because it can be used as a buzzword, right? So we can use this kind of for this changing, morphing group, right? But that we can also assign stereotypes to, right? Which is extremely dangerous. Stereotypes are already dangerous, and then kind of being able to easily change kind of who fits into that stereotype at any time or in any context is also difficult. It can also be used as a racial code word, right? You can be talking about a certain group, and in that context, in that society, refer to them as underclass. Doesn't sound so bad, but you're actually not so explicitly maybe referring to a specific racial or ethnic group, right? And then it can become a stereotype, right? What's also dangerous about it is it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And treated accordingly. So underclass can be seen as causative, right? Being part of the underclass can cause you to be poor, can cause you to act in a deviant way, or at least we can perceive that to be the case, right? So some other kind of words that we use all the time that have judgments or assumptions that you make. Unemployed. What are some of the assumptions that we take with unemployed?
I mean, like welfare dependent.
Okay.
Lazy?
Okay.
Having intention to be employed.
Okay. So should be employed.
Inability.
Inability?
Abilities to be employed.
Okay, right. So is perfectly able, but maybe is choosing not to be employed? Okay. Do we associate it with any sort of group or class?
Probably
Young people.
they're poor.
Okay. Possibly the poor.
Also young people.
Young people? Is that-
Yeah, in Europe.
Oh, sure. So depending on the context, it can be very different. But generally, we don't think of kind of upper middle class white males as the unemployed group, right? So there are a lot of connotations that we associate, even though it's very possible for, in Europe and in the United States, for a young, able, white male to be unemployed, right? But that's not what we think of when we think of the unemployed, right? There's a lot of ideas of certain groups, maybe lazy, maybe not trying hard enough to get a job, right? So there's things, and then the unemployed, assuming that they should be employed. Employed is the norm, and they are deviating from that norm, right? What about patriarchy? What baggage is tied to that word?
So it's totally pejorative, and it like kind of paints a picture that like men are actively like presiding over society.
Okay. Now, you say it's totally pejorative, and it is in our circles. But do you think that's the case in all contexts? Or in all historical contexts? Has it ever been used as a positive? Is there anyone here that still would see it as a positive? Okay, so but you're right. Definitely in debate circles and in a lot of education, we now view patriarchy with this negative connotation. What about matriarchy? Do we have the same connotations with it? Why is that?
Because I think people tend to associate matriarchy more with like motherhood and like goodness and like kind of care rather than oppression and...
Sure.
I think it's also just mythologized, because we don't have many examples of presently functioning matriarchies,
Right.
that we kind of put it in some idealized concept of the past.
Sure. And you're talking about the minority, right? The minority group would be. And when you look at matriarchal and patriarchal societies, I don't know that there's less aggression or violence or domination in the matriarchal groups, but we just know less of them, and also we are associating them with male and female groups, and male are dominant in our society, right? So we see this kind of dominance as a negative. What about hegemony? Another word that generally we use as a bad word, but not everyone does, right? What associations do you have with that one?
Excuse me, what word?
Hegemony.
Jimmy?
Hegemony.
Hegemony. Like dominance.
Okay, dominance. But when you say dominance, is this a kind of a neutral dominance, or how do you view this? What kind of value do you place on dominance?
I have a lot of corruption comes into hegemony in my mind.
Okay. Did you have a comment?
No, I feel like dominance is having powers over someone or a group. I think intentionally. That maybe that's like the assumption.
Okay.
That right.
Are there any other associations that you place with it? Does anyone? Go ahead.
I think it connotates a lot of things about like Western liberal democracies or America,
Okay.
like our colonial powers.
Yeah. So there's certain countries that that word gets thrown around quite a bit more, and in those countries there are groups that maybe don't see it as a negative, right? Is there anyone that can think of any examples of positive connections to that word, or not?
Like a lot of people who are nationalistic think it's a good thing
Okay.
or support it.
Okay, but generally seen as an oppressive word, right? Here's a good one for, I think, this location, because these next two words are seen, depending on where you are, in very different lights. Capitalist. What is capitalist tied to for you?
Greed.
Yeah.
Greed, okay.
I mean, from where I come from, that word is used quite a lot, and it has like a really negative connotation. And you know, when someone calls out the word capitalist, it's a stereotype of a white male, but very greedy, with a suit, and just oppresses the labor worker.
Okay. I know that when I'm hanging out with friends, kind of in this part of the world, they'll joke around anything I do, oh, your capitalist ways, kind of, with anything, right? Like, even if I'm in a hurry, or, you know, are we ready to go, anything, right? It'll kind of expand its definition. In the United States, is it always a negative word?
No.
Not at all, right? I mean, it can be in maybe a debate round, but generally it's seen as a positive.
Yeah, it's like entrepreneur, someone who takes the initiative, someone who's willing to like get things done.
Right. Does that have the same perception for those of you that aren't from the United States?
Well, I mean, I don't agree with some of the things that it's said by various groups in my country, but, you know.
But when you hear it, do you ever think, oh yes, you know, entrepreneur,
Well, it's like
self-starter, hard worker, right?
it's like socialists in the United States, where like the minute you tell an American socialist, they think of Stalin and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay, so that was actually my next example, right? So, socialist. It's interesting because obviously there's areas here that are much more closely tied to that concept, right? In the United States, for many groups, socialist is a bad word. And I'm not saying socialist like the extreme version you might be thinking. I'm talking about, oh, we provided health care, we are radical socialists, right? And that is seen as maybe the worst possible thing, right? Radical socialists. I mean, it's you know, now we're talking about, and it's completely conflated with some sort of, you know, extreme communism at the same time.
You know, I mean, and it's very associated with like totalitarian regimes. You know, like they'll say like Hitler provided free healthcare before he decided to take over everything.
Exactly. The immediate connection is oppression and loss of all freedom. Right? Is that how the rest of you see socialists?
No.
Okay, so one more. Feminist. But this is one that is interesting depending on your group, right? What are some of the kind of value judgments you place with the word feminist? And once again, this is a unique group. But what are some value judgments that either you place, and you might not be scared to say it, or some people you know place?
It's like a really big pleasure to stay with a person who's a feminist, because then they can give you the conception of them, and how do you need to take the perception of the woman in the world. And that's from my point of view, it's a really big respect, and then a big value of it, and yeah.
Okay. What are some other judgments we place on the word
Well, I think first we heard nuts, because I think oftentimes when you hear someone who's just a very outspoken feminist, you think of like radical feminism, lesbian feminism, just very anti-men, like angry feminism, and just think of it as like a combative type of perspective.
Okay, so,
I think misogynist or like anti-men.
okay, good.
It's more like positive discrimination. Positive discrimination.
Okay,
It's placing women above men, if you say it in that way, no matter if those women are actually better than men or just because they're women.
okay.
It heavily hinges upon what type of feminism you're exposed to the most. Definitely, if you see more radical feminism in your life, you're going to have much more of a negative connotation to it. But if you've seen other forms of it, then that perception changes.
Or what you're not exposed to, right? Yeah. So I work at an institution where a lot of the students are probably just not exposed to feminism. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I mean,
And so their idea is an extremist view, not my students, but but some students, right? And so we'll hear the term feminazi, right, which is almost equivalent to feminist in their mind. And there's this underlying assumption that feminists think women are better, or women deserve more, or they only care about women, right? So for those of you in the audience that might self-identify as a feminist, is that accurate?
No, not at all.
No way. I believe that society made this. For example, Europe with laws with 30% of women, they sound too feminist.
Okay, so you're saying laws that maybe try to accommodate
Yeah.
for gender
Yeah.
create this anti-feminist
Yeah.
understanding?
Pretty much.
And I think what creates the anti-feminist understanding is the same what creates the anti-gay understanding and anti-very many things. Is that the media radicalizes basically those movements. Because what we hear is the same way like in Poland when you look at gay people, you only hear about those gay people who are so outspoken, they just go in the streets and they just really want to show off with that. And it's the same with feminists, they only show the most extreme versions of feminism so that society as a whole is not exposed to anybody else who doesn't care, just has this very extreme image created, and that's the problem I think.
Okay. And that's an interesting, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that probably people are also unaware of how bad the situation is in the world, because I don't know if many people know how much gender inequality is there left in the world. So the movement needs to exist, but they don't see the need for this movement anymore, because maybe they live in this Western bubble where they don't see actual inequality, but there is a lot of inequality.
Sure. And once you do have a group that has maybe been oppressed for a long time, the exceptions stand out in your mind. So because there are some women that have kind of reached certain levels, those stand out in people's minds and they say, well, what's the problem, right? Women can reach that. And they're not necessarily looking at the more general inequalities that are happening in society. Once again, often perpetuated by language. When we talk about media's portrayal, right? Media uses language in a very careful and manipulative way to create a certain image, right? Even terms like feminazi, right? That comes out from someone and it's carried, and now we're tying it to feminists, right? And some people are actually equating that, right? Taking a word that is extremely emotionally charged, Nazi, and tying it to a term for a movement, right? What could be more powerful than that? What could create? No matter what, it's hard to not have, even if you're coming from a much more liberal viewpoint, it's hard to not have an immediate reaction to that word, right? Because it evokes certain feelings, it evokes a certain image, right? And then that image is naturally tied to that word. And it's hard to break it apart, right?
Well, maybe I'm out of the ordinary, but the anger that saying feminazi sparks in me is that people will be so close-minded as to equate Nazism with being a feminist.
Right.
Like, to me, that's offensive.
Well, it's extremely offensive, right? It should be. But at the same time, for some people, even with offense, now you have an image, right? An image that's not realistic, right? An image that would be, if it is extremely rare, but it's still an image that now you have tied with kind of the prefix of that word, okay? So kind of going back to altering perception with language, we can see that like these labels further entrench or influence an individual or group's kind of outcome or status, right? So language carries an incredible amount of power, and that's not something we can avoid, and it's not necessarily bad. But we use language all the time in debates, and so it's important to be critical of the perceptions that we're creating and that we're influencing. So I'm going to talk about the way we use language, how we use language in rounds and why that matters, how it affects the clarity of our arguments, how it's tied to these underlying assumptions, and we'll talk about that. We've talked about that quite a bit, but we'll do a little bit more, and how it affects the persuasiveness of the argument and may influence the assumptions of your judges. So an example of how it affects clarity, I was in a round with some of you yesterday, and the round on secession. And we're talking about minority groups seceding. And then there was a discussion in my round about minorities in that group, right? And it became extremely convoluted because the different teams were talking about minorities in the minority and majorities in the minority, and it became extremely confusing. It took, as judges, us quite a bit to tease that argument out. And so part of the feedback that I gave the teams afterwards would be, what would be another way, other than saying the minority in the minority group? What's another way that we could maybe word that for clarity? No ideas? If you were in that round. If you were talking about, say, the small group of people that didn't want to secede in a seceding state, how would you refer to them?
Loyalists?
Okay.
Isolated group,
Okay. Isolated group.
they're opposing to secession.
Okay, so there's lots of other ways to maybe identify them other than using the same term for two different groups. It's not incorrect to say the minority group in the larger minority, right? But it's confusing. So once again, here's an example of where word choice is important for clarity. And to be persuasive, you need to be clear. Your judges need to know specifically what you're talking about without having to do too much work, right? So there's lots of ways. I suggested saying the minority in the seceding state, right? There's lots of ways to phrase this, but try not to use the same term. And this happens a lot because we hear a term and then it becomes a buzzword in the round, right? Try not to use the same term if you're trying to nuance a different meaning, right? It's also tied to assumptions and value judgments. So what are some assumptions if you were to hear the motion, this house believes the bikini is as bad as the burqa? Assumptions here.
That both of them are bad or one of them is bad?
Okay, so we're already starting with the assumption that the burqa is bad, right? And now the burden is to prove that the bikini is also bad, right? How is that different from, say, this house believes the bikini is the burqa of the West?
It's a lot less negative, there's a lot less like an accentuation of negative. With a lot of the previous one, the word bad is like, the word bad is clearly in the the word bad is clearly an emotion, so it takes more of a negative side.
Right. So we're explicitly telling you to value this as a bad thing, right? If you were to have a debate, this house believes the bikini is the burqa of the West, what is that debate?
I think it makes you compare cultures more.
Okay.
In a way like West versus the rest of the world, i.e. probably here in the Middle East. So
Okay.
it kind of makes you do a comparative between cultures.
So what are some of the arguments like that people make in rounds that are positive and negative for wearing a burqa? There's feminist arguments on both sides, right? What are some of them?
Like the idea of oppression, right? Like saying this double standard where men and women, you know, like men can do whatever they want to show how much skin, whereas women can't, right? Like,
okay.
This is the idea of oppression, whereas the other one's like cultural relativism, right? Like if she feels this is part of her identity, then she should be able to do so.
Okay, exactly.
I think beyond that, oftentimes the burqa for women who wear it is a symbol that my appearance shouldn't matter as much as what I have to say, and so being modest is actually beneficial in society because it doesn't idolize a woman's appearance.
It's also sort of a protective way. The burqa is used to protect women from other men who want to attack her in a way or insinuate her sexually. So they use this to try to protect them and don't cause that thing to happen.
Is that a positive or negative argument for wearing it?
That is.
Depends, I guess, right? From your perspective.
Yeah, it depends because they use it as a positive argument. That's one of the things that they use as a positive thing. It's actually good for women to use the burqa because it protects them from men.
So when we explicitly say is as bad as, it limits the debate to comparing two things that are negative only, right? When we talk about it is the burqa and we're just making a comparison, then we can pull those feminist arguments because they're on both sides for both the bikini and the burqa, right? And we can have a fuller discussion, right? And talk maybe about the arguments against either, or the positive arguments against one, how it's a right to expression in two different contexts, right? So there's definitely arguments on both sides, but how we word this affects our assumptions. And that's why also Philip, yesterday in his lecture, talked about how every word in the motion matters, right? And it's not that, we have to get down to, okay, it said the. What is the? mean, right? But every word matters in a motion like this, because as bad as or is the of the West are two different debates, right? And some students, especially students that are more beginning than you, might glance at that and see those as the same debate. And that's problematic, right? And I saw some debates yesterday that did that kind of oversimplified that, and I'm going to actually talk about that in just a minute. So another example from yesterday is assuming a perspective, right? So I was in a round yesterday, once again, talking about secession. This was a round that had a lot of opportunity for confusion. And I had all four teams, without much expansion, say, an example is what happened in Kosovo, right? Without really explaining what their perspective on what happened in Kosovo was, right? It became, by the end of the round, very clear that there were at least two, if not three, different perspectives on what that meant to say it is like what happened in Kosovo, right? Also, two judges from different backgrounds from all of the debaters probably had at least a fourth and maybe a fourth and fifth perspective of what they were even talking about. And I'm not talking about small differences. I'm talking about major differences, because both sides were using that example in completely different ways, right? Another kind of example about the influences of assumptions, and Philip talked a little bit about this in the demo round, right? Unpaid interns, right? So like the unemployed, unpaid interns, what are the assumptions?
They should be paid.
Okay, that they should be paid, right? That now we're deviating from the norm, which I don't believe is the norm in many cases, of paid interns, right? What happens when you say just interns? What do you assume?
Beginner.
Do you assume paid? No, not necessarily, right? So it's not that it's unpaid versus interns, and interns is the norm. So if you were to say paid internships, would that have changed the debate at all for your assumptions? Or if you had just said interns, we'll ban interns, would that have changed the debate? Quite a bit, right? So I want you to kind of, I'm going to make a few different statements that, once again, people that aren't as advanced as yourselves might glance at and see as similar debates, but I want to kind of spot some of the differences on how, when we look at all of the words, it changes it, right? So my first one is, this house would subsidize individuals who are not working. My second one is, this house would provide subsidy to unemployed workers. And my third is, this house would subsidize workers laid off by big corporations. Okay? There are a lot of debates where, if you're making this argument, you could word them in all three ways, right? But it's going to change. So what are some of the differences we see in these three statements?
We see that, for example, in the third one, the one about large corporations. See that there's like a guilt put upon these corporations. So we see that we have a guilty, one is a group or person or institution is guilty and should be attacked in one way or another during the debate.
So there's a clear agent that caused this,
yeah, exactly.
right?
For the first one, I think the first motion is more neutral. It will help those who aren't working. The word unemployed is in there, that buzzword is absent. So, like, to me, it just seems that that's more of a neutral motion that doesn't have to.
So it's kind of just the state of affairs.
Yes, it's the state of affairs.
Okay, good. So then when you move to provide subsidy to unemployed workers, how does that change from just a simple state of affairs? It's a smaller change, but there's still a change.
I think you're talking about the responsibility of people who aren't working and whether or not they are lazy, kind of, and don't want to work.
Okay.
But if they wanted to, or whether or not they just are unlucky and can't find a job.
Okay.
Kind of like the way the worker is portrayed.
So it kind of moves that responsibility from absolutely being kind of an individual choice to potentially more contextual variation. It's still a state of affairs. But it does imply, because they're unemployed workers, that they should be employed, that they are workers, and that is what they are supposed to be doing, right?
I believe that also the word provide, like it would connotate the fact that there should be an involvement of the state, and that they should be, it's sort of like brings the idea of help to these people who are unemployed or.
Exactly. So subsidize and provide subsidy can carry different assumptions, right? Or at least a different perception, right? To provide subsidy is more like, some people can see a handout, right? Where subsidize is more a mechanism of kind of governance, right? And then when you say provide subsidy to workers that are laid off, how does that now change the debate?
It almost like exonerates them from any blame, right? Like they're not the ones who are unemployed, they just got laid off.
Okay.
I think it charges even more like big corporations. It's like, and like if it were like mom and pop businesses, it'd be much different because like, well, maybe they had to. Big corporations is like, well, they're doing it for the bottom line. All they care about is profit.
Right. So depending on your goal for the round, how you word this is going to make a big difference in your persuasiveness, right? So you're talking about where the judge can be influenced to where the responsibility lies, and how much they might feel like what you're doing is the right thing to do. So depending on your goal, it's going to work more or less in your favor, right? And this also, once again, we saw that in the demo round, right? Talking about, is it unpaid interns or volunteers, right? Very different concepts, and there was some confusion in that round because we didn't have the clarification we needed, but also because they were trying to kind of skew it in one way or another, right? So motions are generally worded carefully, and that's what the debate is supposed to be about. When you do it, and Philip mentioned this in his lecture yesterday, write down the words of the motion because they matter, right? People actually think about it. So what are some strategies that we can use when you can't come up with the right words? So this is particularly for the non-native speakers. What happens if you just can't come up with exactly the right words that you want to use? What are some strategies you use?
You could listen to the opposing team's arguments and the words they use to kind of get a glimpse of like what the language that you're using is. Maybe you could try from your own knowledge to find words that counteract what they're saying.
So yes, that's definitely a strategy to use these same words, and we see in debate rounds how we kind of get buzzwords created in this particular round and people start using the same words. Where to be very careful is that you are actually using them in the same way, right? So just like we were talking earlier, you want to make sure that you are referring to them in the same way so that you're not, just kind of crossing paths using the same word but in completely different arguments. A lot of times I see students use metaphor, right? That can be very powerful. I think it is very powerful. Actually, as native speakers, almost every phrase we utter has some level of metaphor in it. You also have to be careful. So another example of a round I saw. Be careful when you're using metaphor that you are critical of the metaphor you're using, right? So when you are talking about, say, a minority group, metaphors that are unequal are not always good. Parent-child metaphors can be criticized, right? Animal metaphors or inanimate object metaphors, definitely problematic, right? So think about, yes, metaphor is good, but be careful about the metaphors you use. So be critical of your own language use and be precise when you can. If you're going to use metaphor, make sure it's persuasive metaphor, okay? And we have just a couple more minutes, but I want to kind of throw out a motion and think of some of the arguments that just come up to the top of your head really quickly. This House would impose a tax on men to reduce the gender pay gap. What are some claims that you may make associated with that motion?
On men to do what? Sorry?
To reduce the gender pay gap. A tax on men.
I'm sorry, are you looking for arguments?
Yeah, what are some arguments that might come up in this debate round? Either side.
Equality.
Okay, what would actually be the claim?
In order to make equal the amount earned between women and men, the government needs to step in and make that tax so that men and women are making the equal amount of money for the equal job.
Okay, good. So this is a government argument. Lots of assumptions on the word choices that he used, right? Equality, right? We're not, even though we're talking about tax just on men, we're now associating equality with taxing only one, right? What was the rest of the argument? You say
The men and women, it's on average for the same job, women make so many cents less per hour or so many dollars less per hour. And so by country, government should be able to tax the men specifically in order to make the same job pay the same amount.
okay. So by the words you're using, you are tying this to an idea of equality, not an idea of oppressing men, right? You're also creating that the government should do this, has some sort of moral requirement to do this because of this inequality. What are some other arguments that might come up?
Against this, on the legitimacy of the woman's skills.
Okay.
Because if you say that the woman cannot, nowadays, women have, in Western countries, women, can have the same education. They are they are as talented as men. So if it's given this, then it's going to kill the legitimacy of women.
Okay, so it takes legitimacy away from women, right?
Another opposition argument is that it allows corporations to continue the same practices of paying women and men unequally because the government is then going to retroactively step in and tax those men rather than forcing corporations to provide equal pay.
Okay. Yes. So basically, it's an argument that allows this perpetuation of inequality, right?
That this would create resentment by men towards women basically men would resent women for not having this tax on them and wouldn't support women's rights movements that would actually solve the problem.
Okay. Why would they resent?
Because they would feel like they were being unfairly taxed for something that wasn't their fault.
And thinking about the ESL issue also, one could argue or question why the LGBT community gets paid differently, because the word is gender.
Okay.
And the assumption is, now we're only talking about men and females.
Okay, interesting.
If I was prop, I would characterize what I was doing as a privilege tax, right? Like that men got privilege of being paid more, so we're taxing their privilege. And if I was the op, I would call the benefits to women a subsidy.
Okay,
right?
Good.
So if I like it, it's a privilege tax, and if I don't like it, it's a gender subsidy.
Okay, so what we were talking about before with the euphemism and dysphemism, right? You can take this min tax, right, and make it either a privilege tax or a subsidy, right? Going the other way, right? So when we hear this House would impose a tax on men to reduce the gender pay gap, I think that the wording is very interesting because it is actually a fairly balanced motion. It goes in both directions, right? Impose a tax. What comes up? What assumptions do we come up when we hear the word impose a tax?
But obviously men won't like this.
Okay, but then the second half of this is to reduce the gender pay gap. Assumptions with that.
The gender pay gap is real.
That there's already an inequality. We're already assuming an unfair advantage, right? Okay, so I think we're about supposed to be done, and we're going to be doing some exercises in a few minutes. Are there any questions? No? Okay, so please, a question to you is, as you move into your exercises and then your rounds today, please be critical of the words that you use and the way that you use language in these rounds, both to increase your persuasiveness and also to kind of continue to create a positive discourse that you want to support. Thanks.
I know when you're talking about PC speech, you know, you can do the good thing or you can go too far. Like handicapable, it's not probably too far. Oh, no, there it is. Instead of differently able. Okay.